In the year 1346, a peculiar theater group became well known across the Italian Peninsula. The stories about their performances sound unbelievable by today's standards. Among the claims were incredible fire tricks, gravity-defying stunts, and elaborate set designs that the group would leave behind, offering shelter to local beggars. They even brought in wild animals that baffled the most educated viewers. These bizarre acts led to accusations of witchcraft being hurled at them from every corner. Their shows caused such a stir that, by October of 1347, the authorities issued warrants for the arrest of the troupe's members. But just days after the warrants were announced, rats carrying the deadly bubonic plague arrived on ships from Crimea, and the disease spread rapidly, wreaking havoc across the region. The troupe, too, was hit hard by the plague, and only 4 members survived: the troupe's playwright and his 3 children. Rumors started to surface in 1348 that the troupe had regrouped, with the playwright now leading them. Intriguingly, all the new performers were children. Despite their age, these young members put on performances that were just as intricate and breathtaking as the previous ones. The troupe seemed to be on the verge of major success again, drawing attention, and no doubt the ire of both the church and local authorities, when they were struck by another wave of the plague. Several months later, the troupe apparently came back for a 3rd time. The playwright, easily recognized for his unusual height and striking red hair, was seen promoting a new performance in the town square. That night, he managed to gather an audience for the show. What happened during the performance remains a mystery because, after the show, every single person in the crowd disappeared. The following evening, the playwright was again seen promoting a 2nd show, this time accompanied by a ragged little girl. The two managed to attract a small crowd once more. And once again, every person vanished without a trace. This strange occurrence repeated itself for 6 nights in total. By the end of this run, a total of 407 people had disappeared. Then, as mysteriously as they had come, the playwright and his troupe vanished as well. It turns out that the playwright is none other than inmate 17, Ward 1, the Harlequin. For more details about this inmate, please refer to his primary and secondary files. The events described above were completely unknown to the staff at AHH NASCU until the afternoon of January 19, 2025, when the inmate requested an unscheduled meeting with our specialized interviewer, Rochelle B. That's me. I should note that right after this interview, the inmate attempted to kidnap me. I strongly believe that his reasons for doing so are connected to the information he shared during the interview. In order to present the facts as clearly as possible, I've transcribed the interview with the inmate first, followed by my own experience with him afterward. And just to clarify, I'm still terrified and have no intention of speaking with this inmate again under any circumstances. Interview subject: the Harlequin. Classification: uncooperative/indestructible/Olympic/protean/critical/egregore.
Interviewers: Rachel Beck, Christophe Vu.
Interview date: January 19, 2024. When I love, I become weak. That's why I choose to enjoy everything without ever truly loving anything. But sometimes, love comes for you whether you want it or not. It happened to me after I was banished from my own city for the first time. A long time ago, I fell for a theater troupe. So I joined them. I wasn't in charge, but I should have been. I did all the work. I built the sets and painted them. I set up the props and I tore them down. I stitched together pieces of old, dusty fabric into costumes, then tore them apart again to make entirely new ones later.
Isong.
I danced. I acted. Most importantly, I wrote the plays. I did it all with a skill, speed, power, and precision no one else could match. It was because of me that our shows became legends. I won't waste your time describing all the details. I'll show you later. You'll love it. Trust me. Back then, there was money in theater. Not much, but enough that I wouldn't have bothered with it if it wasn't for the money. But after the profits were split among the troupe, we somehow felt poorer than we did that morning. Theater wasn't a respected profession back then. It wasn't even accepted. That's part of why I loved it. Theater was often the last resort, a calling born from desperation. Like any profession that society looks down on without reason, those who found their way to the theater were the lost. Orphans, criminals, the disabled, prostitutes, thieves, runaways. Me. All of us were lost until we found each other. Once we found each other, we looked out for one another. We weren't kind, though. I won't pretend we were. No one survives by being kind. But we had something more important. Community. We all needed each other to survive, so we created a community. Community is the purest form of light. I hate the dark. I fear it. I despise it so much that I made sure the darkness could never enter my city. I am a being of light, and a being of community. You'll never find a tighter-knit community than one formed by a group of lost people who were forced to find each other. Once we found each other, we worked together. And our work was our performance. I loved it. Performance is the one true art that serves everyone, everywhere. It's also essential for survival. Every single one of us performs all day, every day, unless we happen to be exceptionally lucky. We accept that about ourselves. We accept that we need to perform in order to belong. But when it comes to others, we don't seem to accept that same truth. In fact, we go out of our way to punish others for performing, any chance we get. For some reason, bringing others down for using the same survival tactic we do somehow boosts our own sense of superiority. Yet, there are those who, whether due to appearance, chance, lack of education, pure exhaustion, or outright rebellion, simply can't meet society's expectations for performance. There are others who completely refuse. And then there are even more people, many, many more, who manage to perform well, day in and day out, until their mask shatters for reasons beyond their control, revealing their true selves. In my experience, their true selves are every bit as beautiful and valuable as the performance they put on. Sadly, society doesn't always see it that way, and we all have to live within society's confines. Ironically, the ones who cannot perform or can no longer perform or just don't want to perform in everyday life are often the greatest performers the stage, and the screen for that matter, will ever see. My troupe, the one I loved, was no exception. The troupe taught me many lessons. The most crucial being that the talent of the group is just as important as the talent of the individual. Another major lesson is that the most exceptionally talented people are often the ones no one even notices. I loved uncovering talent that others overlooked. You'd probably call me a scout. I would scour the streets, the alleyways, the churches, the orphanages, the brothels, and the fields, searching for people who were as talented as they were lost. I had a special focus on the abandoned. Not because I had any malicious or selfish reasons, but because those who are abandoned are the most lost. And I know that from experience. I was abandoned once, long ago. When I want to, I can be very charming. And whether I want to or not, I'm incredibly dominating. No matter what, I am the strongest force I know. That made me an incredibly successful scout. So successful, in fact, that my soft spot for the lost and abandoned meant that, before long, my troupe had more members than we could use. This led to infighting, and it was dramatic. As I've said, kindness doesn't help you survive. With so many people and too few roles, kindness vanished. To stop the chaos, I decided to write more plays. Enough for everyone to have a starring role. It seemed like a good plan. More plays, more performances, more money. But the man who led the troupe disagreed. He said it was too much to memorize, too many sets to build, too much work. Which was completely unfair, considering I did most of the work while he pocketed most of the money. He wouldn't see it my way, and eventually he fired half the troupe. I took the ones he fired and formed a new, better troupe. And naturally, I continued my scouting. One day, I came across a little girl with green eyes and the most hideous patchy hair. I could see the bugs crawling in her hair as clearly as I could see the bruises on her skin. She was absolutely terrifying in every way, but she was the greatest talent I had ever seen. The only thing standing between us was the woman who had caused those bruises. I took care of her and brought the girl into my fold, into my light. Her talent quickly surpassed my expectations, so I wrote a play just for her. The rest of the troupe was furious at first, but once they saw her perform, every one of them fell silent in awe. That's when I knew I had struck gold. She was so special that I adopted her. She became my first child. Now, I'll be honest. A theater is no place to raise a child. Not back then, anyway. The business was ruthless, the streets were dangerous, and the venues themselves were old fire traps. We performed for the working class when we could, and most times we were lucky to finish a show before the church or the authorities kicked us out. More often than not, we performed in the slums. I can still taste the despair that thickened the air. It was like a miasma, coating my throat. I've told you before, we who were lost until we found each other formed a community. A community is essential for survival, but it doesn't always guarantee a good life. Our days were filled with sickness, anger, and scarcity. We had little food and even less money. I had to comfort the children often, and sometimes the adults as well. I can't tell you how many times I woke in the middle of the night to find one of the actresses crying into her pillow. Her story was heartbreaking. Most of the others had stories just as tragic. Even my own story was sad. It's a miracle we didn't cry more often. As I said, this was a vocation born of desperation. But eventually, it seemed like our luck had turned, especially with my ragged little green-eyed star as the headliner. She was a terrible child, but a good girl at heart. She'd call me Papa when she wanted something, then kick me if I didn't give it to her. I'd threaten to poke her eyes out, and she'd respond with something much worse. Then I'd laugh and give her exactly what she asked for. How could I not? She was my daughter, and she was extraordinary. She had such an impact on the audience that I knew I needed to find more children like her. And I did. I searched through the lost, the broken, and the battered for more exceptional children. It was so easy. They came to me just like I came to them. They say opposites attract, but in my experience that's one of the least true sayings ever. Like attracts like because we long for others who are like us. But many of us don't like ourselves or aren't honest with ourselves, so we convince ourselves otherwise. I'm not like most people, and neither were my children. That's how we found each other. Before I knew it, I had 3 extraordinary children of my own, each one calling me Papa when they wanted something, and kicking me when I didn't give it to them. None of them were quite as talented as my frightful green-eyed little monster, but they were close. Every single one of them was close. So special, so capable, so full of worth. Yet they had all been discarded. The world's loss, my gain. Just as we began to thrive, just as I had finally started to make what I love as strong and safe as I am, the plague struck. It struck down the whole troupe. I loved them all so much that I made myself their caretaker. I held the actress as she choked on her own grief. She cried for her mother, who had abandoned her. I didn't cry for her mother, but I cried for her. She was just the first. Within days, everyone else had fallen ill, except for my 3 children. I couldn't bring myself to hold them while they cried, while their lungs dissolved inside them. Not because I didn't love them, but because I loved them too much, and the pain of seeing them suffer was unbearable. I become monstrous when I am in pain. So, I gathered my 3 extraordinary children and fled the city. We held on for as long as we could. The plague-ravaged land, the sun baking everything in sight, is something I will never forget. Not because it frightened me, but because of how badly it terrified them. The heavy, sweet stench of decaying bodies wafted from cottages and farmhouses, bloated livestock rotting in the fields, and flocks of carrion crows so thick they blocked the sun. There was no food, no safety, only disease wherever we turned. I survived. Entertainment has always done that for me. It nourishes me in the same way food nourishes you. But my ragged, frightened children, who I barely loved, were starving. And there was nothing I could do to save them. After the plague moved on, we returned to the city. My troupe was gone, dead. Their bodies still decayed where I'd left them. They had vanished into the deep, dark places I fear more than anything. But there were new lost children everywhere. Some were orphans, some victims, some abandoned, some maimed, some mad. All of them alone, all of them lost. I found them. I brought them in and taught them how to build and break down sets, to paint scenery, to stitch costumes in ways that could be undone, to sing and dance and act. But I didn't teach them to write. Children are awful writers, especially when it comes to writing plays. I wrote the plays. They did the rest. We put on shows, we picked the pockets of our patrons, we prowled the crowds, stealing from bystanders. We had no choice. I had so many mouths to feed. So many children came to me. You wouldn't believe it. Most of them had no talent, but it wasn't their fault, so I kept them. A select few, though, those were the exceptional ones. They were the most broken, the most lost, and in their own ways, the most loving. I adopted them too. In total, I had 6 children whom I called my own. The best of them was still that frightening little green-eyed girl, who I both hated and loved. But that was fine. After all, theater falls apart if you only make room for the best. You need the great, the good, the passable, and even the bad, just as much as you need the best. I had all of these in my troupe. They made my life a nightmare, but a life worth living. I liked each of them. I protected them, fed them, and disciplined them, sometimes too harshly, sometimes overly so. I wasn't always perfect, but I was always there. That was more than most of them had ever had. I'll admit, I let it all go to my head. I've always let things go to my head. It's easy when you're the strongest and most powerful thing in any room. And now I wanted to spoil my children. All of them, the best, the great, the good, the passable, and the bad. They'd suffered so much, sometimes by my own hand, and worked so hard. They deserved something better. They deserved a home. So I rewarded them with a tiny city of their very own. I built it myself in a little cove by the river. I started with humble plans, something like a playhouse, but a little more substantial than the sets I built for our performances. Then, I caught my green-eyed daughter watching me as I worked, asking if she could help, wanting to learn from me, my extraordinary child, being as extraordinary as ever. And in that moment, I realized she needed something just as extraordinary as she was. I had been taught long ago that love weakens what I am. It dims everything I can do. It makes me almost powerless. Nothing I had seen or experienced ever made me believe otherwise. Until that night when my daughter helped me build our home. For the first time in all my life, love made me stronger. For the first time, I was able to create something magical for the ones I loved. The other children, the best, the great, the good, the passable, and the bad, helped too. Together, we built our home. An astonishingly perfect little city, made beautiful by my prodigious skill, and made even lovelier by the many imperfections of its child artisans. They stole candles and lanterns to light up every corner of our little city. Too many candles, too many lanterns, too much light. How it glowed in the night, so beautiful and bright. All the children adored our tiny city. My favorite daughter, the one I didn't always like, loved it so much she wrote a song for it. Children aren't any better at writing songs than they are at writing plays, but she managed to surprise me. I shouldn't have been surprised. She was extraordinary, after all, and so was her song. A low, haunting melody, just a bit too melancholic to be a lullaby. She called it To the City Bright. I told her it was well done, but not before offering some suggestions for improvement. Artists must always strive for betterment. As a father, I would have failed her if I hadn't instilled this in her. Despite having a home, my children were still hungry. In the aftermath of the plague, there was so much less than there had been before. Fewer patrons, smaller crowds, little to no income. I didn't need food. Our performances sustained me. But they couldn't sustain my children, who grew more desperate by the day. Children, especially hungry children, especially broken children, are less kind than adults, and far less capable of understanding that survival depends on community. They fought each other constantly, day in and day out. It was maddening, but it was also entertaining, and oddly enough it was inspiring. So inspiring, in fact, that I wrote a play about their ridiculousness. I had never enjoyed writing anything more. I wasn't sure who would want to watch it, but I was thrilled to write it. My excitement mattered more to me than any potential audience. In truth, I was far more eager to see my children rehearse than I was to see any audience's reaction. I hoped that facing their own absurdity would lead to introspection and growth. I didn't believe it would, but I hoped. And if those hopes went unfulfilled, so be it. I would laugh at them anyway. Kindness, after all, isn't essential for survival. The night I finished the play, I gathered my children around and had them read it. By the end of the first act, I was roaring with laughter. None of the children were laughing. Some were crying, their feelings hurt. Others were embarrassed, most were angry. My frightful, ragged green-eyed girl kicked me, which only made me laugh more, and that made her laugh. In an instant, the others joined in. We fell asleep laughing. The next morning, my youngest son woke with sick lungs and abscesses on his arms. The plague had returned, this time claiming my children. I did everything I could. I used every ounce of power I had to save them. When that failed, I pulled power from myself and gave it to them. Nothing worked. All of them died. My favorite daughter, the one I almost hated, was the last to go. I held her as she faded, singing to the city bright through my tears. I told her it was a perfect song, needing no improvement. When she was gone, I tore down the little city we had built. I don't remember feeling anything as I raged through the ruins.
No anger, no despair, no sadness.
But I do remember crying. In the wreckage I found my play, the one so cruel it made my children cry, yet so funny it made them laugh so hard they cried again. Just seeing it brought them back to my mind. I sank down among the ruins of our city and began to read my play. For a while, I could almost believe my children were with me again. I could see them. The words brought them back so vividly, with all their little mannerisms, their speech patterns, their silly movements, their endless whining. I never thought I'd grieve the loss of a child's whine. But that night, I grieved it with all my heart. When I finished the play, I went back to the beginning to read it again. This time, I read the lines aloud in my children's voices, not just mimicking them, but transforming into them, bringing them back if only for a little while. Every time I paused to turn a page, I would laugh or cry. For days, I lay among the ruins of our bright little city, reading and rereading the play until I had it memorized. But with each reading, my evocation grew weaker, as though the memories were a well running dry. It became too much to bear. One night, I set the play aside, precious as it was, and performed it from memory all alone, among the ruins of our little city. In the middle of the first act, my favorite daughter crawled out of the wreckage and began to speak her lines. The rest followed, emerging from the shadows, shimmering into being in the darkness that had once been so bright. They paid no attention to me. They only spoke their lines. I tried to touch them, but my hands passed right through them. I screamed at them, laughed at them, threw things, shoved them, ran through them. No matter what I did, they did not see me. They weren't real. Or maybe I wasn't real. Maybe none of us were. Whatever the truth, we were apart. Even though they looked as real as anything ever has, they were beyond my reach. All I could do was watch them. So I did. Night after night, I summoned my children to watch them perform. On the seventh night, I had a dream. I don't remember it. I never remember my dreams. I hope I never will. But I woke with a purpose. Why would my children stay after their performance? They had nowhere to go. No home to return to. I had destroyed it. So I rebuilt the city, piece by piece, exactly as I remembered it, down to the tiniest imperfections left by my child artisans. When it was finished, I stole candles and lanterns, lighting every corner until the whole structure blazed with light, blinding gold against the night. Then I stepped into the center and began to read our play. Before I finished the opening monologue, they crawled out from the 6 doorways and began their performance. This time I could touch them, but they still didn't notice me. They recited their lines even as I touched their hair, tugged at their costumes, knocked them down, or dragged them off stage. Nothing I did stopped them, not even for a moment. Their line delivery remained flawless. When the performance ended, they linked hands and bowed. Then they split into 6 neat lines, each leaving through a different door. This had never happened before. At the end of the play, they didn't simply vanish like they had before. Instead, they shimmered out of existence, just as the stars fade at dawn. My little green-eyed monster was the last to leave. I crawled after her, calling her name. She didn't notice as she vanished through the door. She kicked it shut, but I caught it before it latched and threw it open. Before me lay a vast, shining void, a glimmering darkness, hungry for light. I tried to step inside, but it was like pressing against a glass wall. I called my daughter's name. I called all of their names, but only the echo of my desperate voice answered. After I screamed myself hoarse, I checked the other doors. They opened to the city streets as they were supposed to.
No voids. No darkness.
Only the bright, beautiful streets built for my broken, extraordinary children. The next day, I read my cursed play again. As before, the children entered through the 6 doors and performed. At the end, I followed my youngest son, the one who had died first, to the 2nd door. I caught it just before it latched and tried to step through. But again, it was like hitting an invisible, unyielding wall. Through the door, I saw blackness, but it wasn't empty. It was void in its purest, most monstrous form. The thought of my children trapped there drove me to madness. I hurled myself at the invisible barrier, desperate to follow them, to bring them back to the light. Couldn't. The next day, I followed my 3rd child to the 3rd door, catching it before it closed. And again there was darkness, only this time it was alive. It shifted, pulsed, and undulated. This time, I crossed into the darkness, only to flip upside down and begin falling. I instinctively reached out for the darkest part of the dark. It burned me, scalding my skin and raising blisters that screamed in agony. I knew, in some primal way, that I had grabbed hold of a dying star, one that had chosen to consume light instead of giving it. Looking up, I saw the 3rd door's narrow square of light spilling into the blackness, and I knew that star would try to break through, to devour the light of my city and everything beyond. I clawed my way up, skin peeling and blistering as I screamed, and reached the little door. I scrambled through it and slammed it shut just as the darkness began to bleed through. I feared darkness. I always have. That's why I built the city bright. I didn't want my children to live in the dark. On the 4th night, I went to the 4th door. Beyond it was the darkest water I have ever seen. In it swam a monstrous shape, a nightmare made of rot and flickering, hypnotic light. I wanted to follow, if only because there was some semblance of light. But I couldn't. No matter what I tried, I couldn't pass through any of the doors. The next night, I tried the 5th door. The night after that, the 6th. I won't tell you what I found. It is too terrible even to speak of. 6 doors, 6 paths, all closed to me. My children lay beyond them, trapped in an eternal, insatiable darkness. And I, too weak to follow, too useless to protect them, was a father who had failed the only ones I ever promised to protect. On the night I tried the 6th door, I had another dream. I don't remember it. I never remember my dreams. I hope I never will. But when I awoke, I had a new purpose. That very morning, I set about advertising the performance of a lifetime. Hyperbole, yes, but I was desperate, and the crowds were gullible. Small, but undeniably gullible. It was easy to lure them to my show. They watched with wide, shining eyes and awestruck smiles. When my children took their final bow and crawled off stage, I guided the audience to follow my green-eyed terror through her door. It was simple. The audience wanted to follow her. After all, she was the best performer. And everyone wants to be near the best. None of the audience members hit an invisible wall. Perhaps that's the privilege of being human. I wouldn't know. And I no longer care. Moments after the last spectator vanished into the darkness, a pair of familiar, small hands shot out from the dark and gripped the doorway. I grabbed them and pulled. My green-eyed daughter emerged, thin and frightened, but still as extraordinary as ever. Her less remarkable siblings, who had followed her through the door, came after her. The great, the good, the passable, and the bad. I welcomed them all, laughing through tears. Once they were all out, I held my green-eyed daughter the entire night, weeping joyfully as she hurled insults at me, telling me to shut up so she could sleep. The next day, we went out into the city to advertise a one-of-a-kind performance. Once again, the audience came, small but easily duped. They watched in awe, following my children through the little door into the vast, hungry dark. Once again, after the last scream faded, a pair of familiar little hands slapped the doorframe. Once again, I hauled my child out of the dark and into the light. Once again, his lesser siblings followed. The next day, we took to the streets to advertise a performance like none the world had ever seen. It was an exaggeration, of course, but exaggeration is the essence of entertainment. Once again, the audience arrived. This time, the crowd was larger, though still gullible. This is how I rescued my dead children and their siblings, by feeding the hungry dark so much it had no choice but to spit them back into the light. The crowds grew, so did our earnings, and so did my troupe. Soon I had all my children back. We were happy. We were a family. We were a troupe. I loved them. My love for them anchored me, trapped me. It made me weak. I hated being weak. All monsters despise weakness. I am no different. But I thought my weakness would save them, until I was no longer exiled from my city bright, until I could bring them there with me. My weakness did not save anything, least of all them. Over the years, they all died again. Some of illness, some of accidents, some of stupidity, some of hatred, some of pain. Only my green-eyed daughter, whom I almost hated, died of old age. "Bring me back again, Papa," she whispered with her last breath. "Like you did before. Please." I tried. I tried harder than I ever had with any of them. But no matter how many plays I wrote, read, memorized, or performed, no matter what I built or destroyed, no matter who I tore apart or sacrificed, nothing brought them back. Not even her. My love destroyed me for so long. When I finally rebuilt myself, I went back to reclaim my city bright. Not for me, but for my children. I hate the dark. I despise it. I fear it. That's why I made sure that not a drop of darkness could survive in my city. And I was so glad. My children had suffered enough in the dark. I knew they would never have to suffer it again. Once I returned to my city, once I made myself stronger than ever. No, I won't tell you how I did it. You are the last person who should learn how to become stronger. I ventured into the dark and found my youngest son, the one who died first. Then I brought him into my city bright, where he died a third time, screaming in my arms. I knew then that I had made an enormous mistake. Death is darkness. Although I saved my children from the dark, it touched them. It wormed its way into their bones and blood. No darkness can exist in my city bright. I made it that way because I hate the dark. My first children were all infected with darkness. If I could go back, I would allow a little darkness. Just a tiny bit. Enough to let my first children in. I told you I don't remember my dreams. That's a lie. I have nightmares. I dream of the ravenous darkness where I lost my children. I dream of their fear and pain. I dream of coming so close to rescuing them, only to be consumed by the dark myself. I never even get to dream of bringing them back. If I do, I don't remember. I find that cruel. That's all my frightful daughter wanted. Her papa to bring her back. I couldn't do that for her. Wherever she is now, I know she's very angry with me for denying her. Sometimes I even feel her kicking me. I've already promised myself that I'll never give you cause to kick me. If you're new here, this may make no sense. It might not even make sense if you're not new. Either way, I'm sorry. The second those words left the Harlequin's mouth, he lunged across the table and dragged me beneath. Everything was wrong. The floor stretched endlessly before me, impossibly far. The table seemed 100 feet overhead. Dust clouds the size of small cars loomed in the distance. Everything was too big, too cold, too bright. The Harlequin's hand crushed my shoulder as he dragged me forward, his body moving in some sinuous, grotesque way that defied logic. At the far end of the floor, how was it so far? There was a band of blinding, brilliant light. Even from a distance, it burned so painfully that I had to squeeze my eyes shut. He dragged me closer. For a terrible second, I thought he was going to throw me in. "Look," he said. Couldn't. Even with my eyes closed, the light terrified me. "Look." He tried to force my eyes open, pinching my eyelids with long, thick fingers. "I can't," I screamed. "You have to look," he insisted. "It's the only way to know which mind you're in." All my other children looked. "Because I'm not your darling girl," I retorted. I kicked away from him. He let me. Keeping my eyes shut, I spun around and crawled the other way. It felt like it took forever, but before I knew it, someone was pulling me to my feet, shoving me as far away as possible. Christophe, of course. Who else would it be? The Harlequin, still beneath the desk, watched me with a smile that made my stomach churn. "I give all my children what they want," he said. "Nothing more, nothing less. That's all I'm trying to do for you. You've made me very angry. So angry that I don't want to be your father anymore. But family needs each other, even when they don't want to be family. I need you, and you need me more. Remember that when I come back, darling girl." His smile twisted as he slithered away into the darkness beneath. The strangest part, though not the scariest, was that he slithered through his own little wormhole right back into his own cell. As if that wasn't enough, I have a meeting with the agency director in less than an hour. He says he's going to show me another one of my creepy employee files. Safe to say, I'm not looking forward to it. Not one bit.